Hi, JW Solar here. Welcome to my Solax settings series. I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into what all the inverter settings mean and do. I'll cover the basic and more advanced settings, so please have a look at the other videos in this playlist. If you'd like to join me on Facebook, I have a group called Solax Support UK. There's also an international group called Solax Installation. So see you there. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next video. So let's start off with opening your Solax Cloud app. You can do this on iPhone, Android, whichever system, and should be welcome to the home screen. Now, many users think that there should be a link straight to remote settings on the home screen because it's something that they change frequently. And the reason that Solax don't do that is because commercial customers that have more than one inverter would need access to more than one inverter's settings, if that makes sense. So which inverter's settings would they put on the home screen? So the way that they've done this is they've made a device tab for all your devices, and then you can choose which device you'd like to change the settings for. So we're just going to click on the device down here at the bottom and go to the devices page. I only have two here. I've got the wireless LAN connection and the single inverter, and you need to click the inverter to which you'd like to change the settings for. If you click here on remote settings, you're taken to the settings which are stored on the inverter. Now the rest of this playlist focuses on all the basic settings and many of the advanced settings that you find on most inverters. Now some inverters do have different settings depending on whether it's an AC or a boost or a hybrid, but this tutorial is based on a hybrid G4 inverter. As you work through these videos, please bear in mind that some settings only reveal themselves after other settings have been changed, so don't expect every setting option to be visible at all times. Another thing is you must click the save button opposite every setting change you make, otherwise it will not be saved or take effect. Many users forget this. They do a lot of settings, press one save button once, and all the other settings are not saved. If on occasion a setting doesn't update or fails, then just please try it again. It's an incredibly complex process that we kind of take for granted and expect to work, but when you analyze what needs to happen between your inverter to your router to the Solax servers to back and all the way back again, it's quite a complex process, so a little bit of patience. If your login times out, then you'll need to refresh that because the settings won't take effect if it's timed out. To access many settings on your Solax app, you'll need to enter an access code. There are three levels of access at the moment. There is the user level, the advanced level, and the super level, and each level has a different access code to access the settings. So the user code is 0000. The advanced, also known as installer code, is 2014, and the super, nobody knows why there's a super menu. Super code, we don't know what super is 6868. And each code also has access to the settings from the previous code. So you can just use 6868 all the time to have access to all the settings, for example. From the settings main screen, you can click setting here, and when you click setting, it'll ask for one of those passcodes. So the first demonstration I'll do, I'm going to put in 0000 and click OK, and that will give me access to the main user settings. The last option in user settings is the user password, and this is fairly self-explanatory. It's to change the password from 0000 to something else, so somebody else who isn't authorized can't access the basic settings of your inverter. So here you can just click on there, type in your new password, click save, and that will then be saved as the user settings password. If I go back and do that again, this time I'll type in 2014 for the advanced settings. And you can see this time I get a menu. I get the same user settings, which was the screen that I had before, and now I have an advanced and a network menu. Okay, so these menus become available depending on what level of access you have. And the last one, if I type in 6868 for the super settings, I'll also get the super menu. Okay, so each setting also has the previous settings. So if you just want to use super all the time, you know you have access to all the settings. If you're training a customer, for example, or an end user, it's probably best that they don't change the advanced super and network settings. So you would just give them the passcode of 0000 to access user settings. So that's how you access the settings. Please move on to the next video to learn a bit more about them. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next video. To set the time, click on the time. Click on the time and date here and you'll get the time and date setting wheels. I'm not going to do it because my time is already correct, and when you finish setting it, make sure you press the save button to save the time to the inverter. And there's a confirmation box which says setting success or setting failed. If it's failed, it hasn't managed to set it and you'll need to just repeat. Now this is usually set automatically by the connection with the Solax servers. But if your connection is local or the communications have issues, for example, you may have to set it manually. There are a couple of things to consider. For example, when you're charging from the grid on off-peak times, the inverter may charge at the wrong time, and this will cost you money if the clock is wrong, so make sure the date and time are correct. When the clocks go forward and back during daylight saving times, it's also important to check that the inverter clock changes at the same time. If it ends up an hour out, you could also end up, for example, charging your battery outside of off-peak times. Checking the time zone is also really important, but you can actually only do that on the Solax Cloud website at the moment. So if you find, for example, your inverter, you set the clock and then within an hour or so it's changed, or it's off by an hour, or it's off by 5 hours, and this is causing you issues, it's probably the case that the time zone is set incorrectly, and you'll need to go onto the Solax Cloud web to set the time zone. I think it's in the site setup. Again, Home Assistant users, the clock's very important to record the data at the correct times in history, so you need the sensors to reset at a specific time, and the same ones on the inverter need to reset at the time. So if they're an hour out, it can cause issues with data history. Moving on to language, very self-explanatory. It's the language that you'd like to see the interface written in. Pick language from the list, click OK, and then click Save to make sure that you save it. The third item in the basic user settings is off-grid mute. Now, I don't think this is a particularly good place to have a setting like this. It's not exactly the first thing that crosses a user's mind. So what is it? If we just expand that. Mute no, mute yes. Now, off-grid mute turns the EPS beep on and off. EPS stands for emergency power supply, and it's what happens when there's a power cut and the inverter starts to supply the EPS circuits with power. So this setting is a way of turning the beep on or off. Now, because it's a mute setting, no turns the beep on and yes turns the beep off. This is also a useful way of knowing if one of the breakers or MCBs in your house is tripped or is faulty, because your inverter will start beeping until it gets fixed. So click on the options, you can pick yes to mute it, no for it to beep, and then click OK, and as usual, click Save. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next video. In the main setting page of remote settings, the second item on the list is work mode. Now, if you click work mode, you'll get a list of the different work modes that the inverter can run in. Work modes are a way of the inverter prioritizing the order of solar, battery and grid and how it's used. And if you click on the standard work mode of self-use, you can see the other work modes that are available. So we have self-use, feed-in, backup mode, manual mode, peak shaving, enhanced TOU and smart schedule. That's on a hybrid inverter. Some of your use modes may be different. Now, each use mode or work mode has different settings. So if you go into the settings menu here and type in the passcode, so I'm going to type in 0000 for basic user settings. Then each of those work modes are listed here. We've got the self-use work mode, the feed-in priority work mode, the backup work mode. And these are the settings that apply to that specific work mode when you select it from the other menu. In self-use mode, the inverter uses the generated solar energy in the following priority order. Firstly, it's used to power the house load. If there's enough energy to power all the house load, it's then used to charge the battery. If there's also enough energy to charge the battery, or the battery is full, it's then sent to the grid as export. If, by any chance, it can fulfill the export requirement, then the remaining energy above the inverter rating is clip. Now clipped just means it disappears and it's wasted. Solar energy will only cover the next priority if there's enough to fully cover the previous one. So for example, if there's not enough solar energy to cover the house load, then the house load will be taken in the following priority order. Firstly, it will be taken from the battery down to the minimum limit, and then it will be taken from the grid. Self-use is the default mode as it's usually the most common one. The other use modes, you can look into those if self-use doesn't suit your circumstances. The inverter will only power loads up to the maximum inverter rating. For example, a 5 kilowatt inverter will power loads up to 5 kilowatt. There is a little bit of leeway on some of the inverters in the range. For example, they offer 10%, so a 5 kilowatt inverter could power loads up to 5.5 kilowatts. Let's have a look at the self-use mode specific settings. If you click on self-use, the settings will be shown below the self-use menu. Min-SOC percentage, this is the minimum percentage that the battery is allowed to discharge to when using this mode. The minimum allowed is 10% as it protects the lithium battery from damage that would occur if it discharged completely. You can set this to a higher percentage if you wish, but 10% is the default to protect the battery. The charge from grid setting, if you enable that, it'll allow your battery to be charged from the grid. Now normally this is used when you want to charge in an off-peak period. You need to set the times that you want the battery to charge, as well as enabling the charge from grid option. The times are set further down in the charge and discharge period menu, and I'll cover that later. When you select enable from charge from grid, let's just demonstrate that and click OK. Once you click the save button, another setting will be revealed. So this just demonstrates, depending on which settings you select, other settings will either appear or disappear. So the setting that is revealed is charge battery to percentage. So when you're charging the battery from the grid, you can set what percentage you like it to stop at. So for example, I could set this to 80%. And click the save button. So the battery will now just charge to 80% when it's charging from the grid at an off-peak time, and the charge from grid has been enabled. A few little tips. Remember to set the min-SOC percentage and the charge battery to percentage under the correct mode menu, as each mode is controlled by its own values. The specific settings of each mode don't affect any of the other modes except for the charge from grid. This enables all modes to charge from grid during the set charge period. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next video. So what's feed-in priority and how does it differ from self-use? To start with, the inverter uses the generated solar energy in a different order. So firstly, like self-use, it's used to power the house load. But after that, in self-use, it's used to charge the battery. But feed-in mode, the next priority is to export the energy to the grid. If by any chance that the limit is reached for grid export, then it will then charge the battery. And if it manages to reach the battery charge limit or the battery is full, it will then clip any excess energy, which essentially means it's wasted. Like the other modes, the energy will only cover the next priority if there's enough energy to fully cover the previous one. If there isn't enough energy to cover the house load, for example, then the house load will be taken from the battery and the grid. So what's this mode used for? Because the second priority is exporting to the grid, this mode is used when the preference is to export energy to the grid because you're on a good export tariff, rather than charging the battery first. It can also be used to delay the charging of the battery until peak solar production in the middle of the day so that clipping doesn't occur. And I'll probably give you an example of that in a minute. Let's say you have a rather large solar array compared to your inverter size. So the solar array is 8 kilowatts peak. Your inverter size is a 5 kilowatt inverter. You have 10 kilowatts of battery storage, and just for our example we're going to use a 1 kilowatt house load. I'll use this case scenario to compare self-use mode to feed-in priority mode. So starting with self-use mode, let's for example say that the battery is 50% charged in the morning. The sun comes up and it's generating 5 kilowatts, if only. The power to the house is a 1 kilowatt load, and therefore the rest of the solar is put into the battery at 4 kilowatts. By 11 o'clock, for example, the battery is full, and the excess 4 kilowatt solar is now exported to the grid. As the day progresses, the output of the panels increases, and by early afternoon at peak production the panels are putting out 8 kilowatts. So the house load's covered, the battery's full, the inverter is going to reach its maximum export capacity of 5 kilowatts, which is covering the house load and exporting to the grid, and there's nowhere else for the extra 3 kilowatts of energy to go. So this energy is then what we call clipped and wasted. Essentially it just disappears into thin air. If we look at the same example in feed-in priority mode, we start exactly the same, 50% battery charged in the morning. The sun comes up generating 5 kilowatts, powers the 1 kilowatt house, and it doesn't charge the battery. Instead it exports 4 kilowatt to the grid. As the day progresses and you reach peak production time, the output of the panels increases to 8 kilowatts. The house load's covered, the inverter reaches its maximum rating of 5 kilowatts, covering the house load and exporting to the grid, and now there's somewhere else for the extra solar energy to go. The 3 kilowatts, which is extra, which got wasted and clipped in self-use mode, now goes into charging the battery, and none of the extra solar generated is wasted. By the time the battery's full in the afternoon, the output of power of the panels will have reduced below the maximum inverter rating, and all the excess energy is exported to the grid. So you can see in that scenario, feed-in mode doesn't waste any of the solar energy, whereas self-use mode would waste a lot of solar energy. Just like self-use, you can set the min sock of the battery. So in feed-in mode, this will be the lowest that the battery will discharge to under normal use. And also the charge battery to percentage. So when you're charging the battery from grid at off-peak times, you can change the percentage that you'd like to charge the battery to. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next video. Backup mode is more suited to locations that have frequent power cuts, and it has actually the same priority order as self-use mode. So the first priority is to power the house load. The second priority is to charge the battery. The third priority is to export to the grid, and then anything after that is clipped and wasted. As before, the solar energy will only cover the next priority if there's enough to fulfill the previous one. If there isn't even enough solar energy to cover the house load, then the house load will be taken from the battery, and if there isn't enough battery, it'll be taken from the grid. Well, why should you use backup mode? The idea of backup mode is to retain enough battery charge to power the house loads in the event of a grid power failure, so in a power cut. And for that reason, it's got its own settings for that purpose. So let's just have a look at the backup mode specific settings. It's very similar to feed-in mode and self-use. So the minimum state of charge that the battery will be drained to is 30%, and this is the default. This just means that 30% is always retained just in case there's a power cut, so that the inverter will then switch into EPS mode and power the house for the duration of the power cut. So essentially it's a reserve that is kept just for backup mode in case of a power cut. The charge battery 2 again is charging the battery from the grid, and you can set that to whichever percentage you like. It's set to 50% by default. It's quite often the mode that's used in off-grid installations and people who live in areas where the power supply isn't particularly reliable. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next video. Let's take a look at manual mode. If I go into the work mode drop down here and then click on what is the normal mode of self-use, I'm going to select manual mode from the options and click OK. And when I click save for the manual mode, you can see that another option appears called manual mode. Okay, now there are three options in manual mode. There is stop charge and discharge, force charge and force discharge. So what do they do? The stop charge and discharge stops all battery activity, charging or discharging. So it won't discharge the house, it won't discharge the grid, it won't charge from the grid, it won't do anything. And essentially this can be used just if you want to not use the battery, disabling it rather than switching it off, or for battery maintenance tasks, for example. The next setting is force charge. So force charge forces the battery to charge from the grid right now, okay? So it doesn't take any notice of any times that you've set, any charge times or any tariffs or anything else. As soon as you click OK and click save, the battery will start immediately charging from the grid. I'll just demonstrate that now. So if I click OK here and click save and go home, you can see that the grid is now supplying 6.45 kilowatts of energy into my battery, and because it's doing that, it will also supply the loads. The last option, force discharge, does exactly the same in the opposite direction, so it's going to discharge your battery to the grid. I'll just demonstrate that now. If I pick OK and then click save, straight away if I go back to the home page, okay, you can see now that the battery is exporting 6.414 kilowatts to the grid. So what is this used for? Well, for example, if you wanted to do battery maintenance, you could set to stop charge and discharge, or if you just didn't want to use the batteries for a certain period of time. You could use the charge option to charge in a very cheap energy slot, for example, from your energy supplier, and you could use the discharge option to discharge in an expensive export slot so that you can grid trade and make money out of that. There isn't any way of scheduling this, there aren't any times to set, it is a manual process, hence it's called manual mode. If you wanted to do this automatically, you would need to look into TOU, which stands for time of use. That's a different work mode, which you can set the manual modes to charge, discharge, or pause the battery automatically using times and schedules. Thank you very much for watching, see you on the next video. Well, let's take a look at peak shaving mode. Now this mode is used just after you get up in the morning and you've got a bit too much stubble and you need to get the razor out. It's all to do with shaving. No, it's not. No, it isn't. It's designed to power loads at peak times and store up energy at off-peak times. So I'll give you a brief overview. Now if we just look at the app, you won't find any peak shaving settings until you change to the peak shaving work mode. So if we go into settings here, and you should know all the codes by now, and I press OK. In the list here, you've got self-use, feed-in, backup, but there's no peak shaving. And those settings are not there until you enable the work mode. So if I go into the work mode here and choose peak shaving from the list and click save. Now if I go into settings and type the code, you can see that peak shaving mode has appeared, and if I expand the peak shaving mode, you'll also see that there are lots of settings for peak shaving. The battery does not discharge at all at off-peak times. It either charges from the grid or charges from solar. For peak times you can set a load limit, and depending on this limit the following will occur. If the house load exceeds the limit, the PV and the battery will power the house. If the house load does not exceed the limit, the PV will charge the battery first and then power the house load. So as you can see here, you can have 2 periods per day. You have a shaving start time for period 1 and an end time for period 1, and the peak limit is the load limit above which the PV and battery will power the house. And then again you can have another shaving start time for a different period. This one's set to 7 o'clock in the evening and ending at 11 o'clock in the evening, and again the peak limit 2 is the load limit above which the PV in the battery will power the house. You can keep scrolling, there are more settings. So charge from grid is enabled or disabled just for the peak shaving mode, and that works in the same way as it does for self-use mode. And then the reserved state of charge for the battery is the minimum battery percentage to discharge to. So a use case scenario for peak shaving, for example, if your energy supplier was to charge you a certain amount for up to a certain power draw. So for example, up to 5 kilowatts, they charged a certain amount, then anything that you used above 5 kilowatts, they would charge a higher amount. So you can set the peak limits wattage here to 5 kilowatts, and anything below 5 kilowatts will come from the grid, and anything above 5 kilowatts will come from the PV or the battery. And essentially what it does is it shaves off the peaks where you'll be charged more, anything above the load limit in your usage. And be careful not to get confused between kilowatt hours and kilowatts. Kilowatts is the amount of power. It's a measurement of power which is being used right now, and kilowatt hours is the amount of power used or measured over a period of time. It's also used for the storage capacity of batteries. So the peak limit is in watts. It is the amount of power which is being used right now. So the threshold is set so that any extra power draw over and above that is taken from the battery or from solar. This is Solax's example of a diagram for peak shaving. Now these are the default times that are set up in your settings. So you can see from 11 o'clock till 7 o'clock is off peak, and then 7 o'clock until 3 o'clock is peak, and 3 o'clock till 7 o'clock is off peak, and then 7 o'clock till 11 o'clock again is peak. So the idea is, in an off-peak period, energy is stored up in the battery ready for the peak period. Now when your usage, your power usage becomes higher than a threshold set by the energy company and they start to charge more money, the battery and the solar then take over running the house load. And essentially it shaves the peak off at the limit that you set. And we get to B and it becomes an off-peak period again, where energy is again then stored up in the battery, and at 7 o'clock becomes a peak period again, and the peak is shaved off because again it goes over the limit that the energy company would charge more money if you went over that power draw limit. So by all means try it. A little bit of a complicated setup, but go for it. Let me know how it goes. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next video. The next work mode we're looking at is, I think it is time of use on the list. Let's go and have a look. Yeah, so time of use. So it's called Enhanced TOU. Now this is an option that you cannot select from the menu. If you go to Enhanced TOU, you will now see that the Save button is missing, and it's not possible to put the work mode into Enhanced TOU. TOU has its own setup in the interface, and I have a video, if you just have a look in my other videos, all about the basic setup of Enhanced TOU. So in this one I'll explain what it does. We're not going to go through how to set it up because that is in another video. TOU stands for time of use, and to be frank, when I found out what it stood for, I was none the wiser about what it actually did. So this mode is used to set up a schedule that runs automatically on the inverter. So if you wanted, for example, more than 2 charge slots, or you actually wanted to do forced discharge slots, or you wanted to select a certain mode for a certain part of the day and a different mode for a different part of the day, then TOU is for you. There are up to, I think, 24 time slots in a 24-hour period, and each time slot can be programmed to change to a different mode, discharge the battery, charge the battery, so there's huge flexibility. This is what the TOU interface looks like. You can set specific days for a schedule to run. You can set specific times to do specific tasks. So here you can see that the standard mode is self-use in purple. The allow charging, I've allowed charging from 2 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock in the morning, which is depicted by the red line. And I've done a force discharge of the battery to the grid between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the evening, which is depicted by the turquoise or blue line there. So essentially you can just add different times to this timeline, and then you can put that schedule into the inverter and it will follow it. And you can set these up for different seasons, different times of year, different days of the week, different times when you're on holiday or you're not on holiday. And TOU allows you to set up templates to predefine whatever schedule that you'd like, and then you can just apply them to the inverter as and when you wish. If you find TOU slightly confusing, please see my Octopus Flux basic TOU setup guide, and I'll do a more complex TOU video tutorial in the near future. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next video. Let's take a look at what Smart Schedule is. If I go to the work mode and choose a different work mode and scroll to the bottom, the last option on a hybrid menu is the Smart Schedule option. If I pick Smart Schedule and click OK, the save button disappears and it doesn't allow me to save it because this is another smart mode, and the smart modes are not selectable by the user. Smart Schedule is a work mode which is only available if you have a data hub connected to your inverter. Now, a data hub is a different piece of hardware. It's a little box that connects to the internet, it connects to your inverter, and it has a little bit of processing power and more memory to run and process more complex schedules. It monitors your house load and learns from that pattern. It also looks at the weather forecast, so it can predict what PV input there's going to be, and it also takes in agile tariffs, so that it knows which the cheap charging slots are and which the most expensive charging slots are, both for importing from the grid and exporting to the grid. From all that information that it gathers, it can then decide when is best to charge your battery, when is best to discharge the battery, and which mode the inverter should be in at what times. And this is supposed to be learned as it goes along, so it's machine learning. I personally haven't tried a data hub, and I don't have one here to demonstrate or test, so I can't show you exactly how it works, and it is still in development. And I'm just really here to give you an overview of what Smart Schedule is, why it's a work mode on the inverter, and how you can get more information and look into it if you want to do in the future. Because it's connected to a data hub, it also has the data hub advantages. You can select all number of if then conditions for the working of it. The data hub can connect to multiple inverters. It can control the export limit on many inverters at the same time. It can upgrade your firmware. Lots of features and functionality in the data hub. At the moment, it's not really targeted at the residential market. It's much more of a commercial product, although what it offers in as far as AI or machine learning or agile tariffs is exactly probably what the residential user needs. So hopefully in the near future the data hub will be available to buy for residential customers, and they'll make it easy to use so that we can get the most out of it. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next video. Let's take a look at charge and discharge periods. So I'm going to click on settings to start with, and then just enter the usual user unlock code. And here we've got charge and discharge period. So if we just open that and have a look at the settings inside. The first two options are a forced charge period start time and a forced charge period end time. Some users find this a little bit confusing. If you set the start time and set the end time, it means that the battery will charge between those two periods, but it won't charge from the grid unless you also set the charge from grid option in the self-use mode. So here you can see it's charge from grid. You need to enable that before the battery will charge between the start time and the end time. And that is often something that is overlooked and isn't particularly clear in these circumstances. The allowed discharge period is nothing to do with forced discharging the battery. It is just to do with allowing the battery to discharge. So if you don't set these times for the allowed discharge period, the battery won't discharge at all. It won't power the loads in the house or do anything else. It'll just do nothing. So you need to make sure that the allowed discharge period time, start time and end time are set for the battery to discharge at all. This is not a forced discharge. This is just a discharge to house loads. For example, if you're on an octopus flux tariff. Now a flux tariff, you charge cheaply between 2 and 5 in the morning and then you use the battery all day to cover the rest of your loads, and then you charge cheaply between 2 and 5 the next morning. So I'm just going to set up this scenario in the settings. The forced charge start time would therefore be 2 o'clock because you would want to start it at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I will set that to 2. Remember to click save after each setting. So I click save after I've set the 2, and then I'm going to move on to the charge period end time and set that to 5. And again, remember to click save after we've set the 5. Now the discharge time, it says 000 here, which is midnight here, ending 23:59, and these times overlap, and it's okay for them to overlap because the forced charge period always takes precedence over the discharge period. So essentially what this is saying is charge the battery from the grid between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock, and at all other times you're going to allow the battery to discharge to the house load. So there's one last thing to remember, which I mentioned before. Under self-use, you need to enable charge from grid for the battery to charge between the 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock. So I'll go here, click enable, OK, and remember to click save. And that will be a typical setup for the octopus flux tariff, charging between 2 and 5, and the battery allowing to be discharged any other time. A few tips. If no time periods are set, the battery will not power the house loads or charge from the grid. The system will do nothing. So you must set discharge times to allow discharge, and if you want to force charge from the grid, you need to set the force charge times and set charge from grid to enable. Charge periods take priority over discharge periods if the times overlap. It's okay for the times to overlap, and the charge periods will take priority, so you don't need to make sure that you start one time period when the next time period finishes. During an active charge period, if the battery reaches the charge battery 2 percentage, which you've set, it won't discharge to power the house loads. The loads will still be powered from the grid until the charge period ends. This is a common misunderstanding of the system. If you wish to turn off the active charge period, you can just set both of the times to 0000, which is midnight, and nothing will happen, and the same applies to the discharge period. In user settings, we're looking at discharge period 2. So if you click on charge period, and then I'll scroll up for you, you can see at the bottom here we've got charge and discharge period 2. So for example, if one charge slot and discharge doesn't suit your tariff or your lifestyle, you can enable the second set of charge and discharge times. And when you enable those and save them, you'll get an option, scroll up again, an option for a charge period 2 start time and end time, and an allowed discharge period start time and end time for period 2. The period 2s work in exactly the same way as the period 1s. You just get an extra set of times that you can use if you want to. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next video. Next in user settings is dry contact. I actually don't really know why it's here in basic user settings. I can't imagine it's a hugely popular option for the majority of end users, and I think it really belongs in advanced settings, but Solax have chosen to put it here. So let's take a brief look at it. I'm not going to go into it in any particular depth because it is a little bit more of a complicated topic. Dry contact is a volt-free relay. So what I mean by that is that a relay is a switch. It's an electronic switch that switches on and off. If there is a voltage present at the terminals on the relay, then it can power other equipment with that specific voltage. This one doesn't have a voltage, so all it is a switch. It makes a contact to create a circuit, and it breaks the contact, and that's what a dry contact is. This is used to control other equipment from your inverter. For example, you could control a heat pump, you could switch it on and off, or you could control a generator, you could switch that on and off, or start it and stop it. And it's also used to control the Solax adapter box. The adapter box is something that you connect to the dry contact, then you use the adapter box to control the other equipment as well. So let's just have a look at the options. Usually in there we have generator control or load management. The load management is example for controlling a heat pump. Generator control is for controlling a generator, so it's fairly self-explanatory. Each one of those has sub-options under load management. It can either be disabled or you can have manual mode or smart save mode in those options. Again, it's an advanced setting. We're not going to go through the detail of it. The dry contact is controlled through the COM port interface of the inverter, and it uses pins 1, 2, 7 and 8. The pinouts of the COM port can vary from inverter to inverter. They're fairly consistent with Solax equipment, but please check your manual if you are connecting to the COM port interface, just in case the pins are different on your particular inverter. I'll do some more about the COM port, the pinouts, what pins 3, 4, 5, 6 do in a different video. That'll be in the advanced section. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next video. In this video, I'm going to go through some typical settings that you can set up in your remote settings depending on which tariff you're on, so you can get the best out of your system. So this is just going to cover basic charge times, basic discharge times, and charging from the grid. The first example is if you use your solar and your battery to power the house loads 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you don't charge the battery from the grid. Let's have a look at the settings required to implement this. Firstly, make sure your work mode is set to self-use. Once you've set the work mode to self-use, you're going to proceed into the settings and type in the 000 code to get into the basic user settings. From there, you're going to go into the self-use menu and make sure that charge from grid is disabled, because we don't need to charge from grid in this instance. After that, you're going to go into the charge and discharge periods. We don't want to do any forced charging because you're not going to charge from the grid, so both the start time and the end time can be left at 0. But what you do need to do is set the allow discharging period times, and you need to set the start period to 12 o'clock 0000 and set the end period to 23:59. And all this will do is not charge from the grid because there are no charging periods and we switched it off, but it'll allow discharging 24 hours a day, 7 days a week from the battery. And the battery will just power the house loads, it won't discharge to the grid. This second example demonstrates if you're on an Eco 7 tariff, for example, or at least an off-peak tariff where you get a cheap charging time. So we're going to set up charging the battery between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning, and all of the rest of the time we're going to be in self-use mode using powering the home from solar and battery power. From your remote settings, make sure that the work mode is set to self-use and click Save. Click into the basic settings and type the 0000 for user settings code. Click on the self-use category and make sure that charge from grid is set to enable and click Save. Moving down to the discharge period, set the forced charge start time to 2 o'clock, that's when the battery will start charging off peak, and set the end time to 5 o'clock, that's when the charge end time will stop for your off peak time. The allowed discharge period still needs to be from midnight to 23:59, which means that all of the times the battery will be used to power the house loads. Make sure you click save against each item that you save. The charge times and the discharge times can overlap. You can see that they do overlap. But all that means is that the charge period will take precedence, and as soon as it's finished, it will go back to the discharge period. In the next example, imagine you're on an off-peak tariff such as Octopus Flux, and you want to partially charge your battery to, let's say, 50% between 2 and 5 o'clock in the morning, so that the solar can then charge the battery in the daytime. And then you only want to use the battery between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the afternoon. This is an instance where your battery is maybe quite small and you want to save it for the expensive peak times of energy. From the main remote settings screen, check your work mode and make sure self-use is the work mode and click save. When you've done that, go into setting, type in the user code of 0000 and click OK. Click in the self-use option, and what you're going to do is enable the charge from grid, because you do want it to charge at your off-peak times of 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock. Remember to click save against every setting that you change. Now, you don't want to charge to 100%, you're only going to charge to 50% and leave the rest up to solar to charge in the day. So you're going to enter 50 into the charge battery 2 box and then click save. That's all you need to do for self-use. Move down to the charge and discharge periods. Now we're going to force charge to the 50% between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock because it's the flux tariff. So set 2 o'clock for your start time, 5 o'clock for your end time. And this time we're going to change the discharge period. So you want to save your battery until the peak times at 4 o'clock. So pick 4 o'clock for the start time and click save. And you want to stop the battery discharge at 7 o'clock. So we can set the end time to 7 o'clock and click save. And that's now set up to charge up to 50% battery from 2 to 5 in the morning and only discharge the battery to the house loads between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the afternoon. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next video.